Hi, my name is Gavin Rajah, and today I'm going to be chatting to you about negotiating skills for creatives. And I'll cover a diverse range of areas which are kind of quite critical in terms of thinking and approaching negotiation for creatives, especially. So, I think one of the biggest things as creatives we are faced with is not really having the tools that equip us or inform us about making proper decisions when we're negotiating. Either we're negotiating in terms of a job, in terms of collaborations, in terms of partnerships, in terms of ventures, and or perhaps even just negotiating skills in terms of securing investment, representation, or agency. So I think it's very important at the basis of all negotiation for creatives to actually understand what do we seek in terms of the outcome of the negotiation. What do we want the business outcomes to be for this negotiation? It's very, very important. And then the other thing is about who really cares about these outcomes. So who are the outcome of this negotiation, who would have the best impact for, and why would it be in the creator's best interest or future interest, possibly. And then who are the parties that can kind of add or contribute to the measurable outcomes of this negotiation or the impact of what the end result of this negotiation is going to be. And then I suppose the most interesting thing is, how do we as creatives engage directly or indirectly with the parties that we are negotiating with? Because this is a really critical thing. And so you've got to rethink these things and your approach before you start negotiation. And I think it's very, very important that you think about these things carefully, because quite often in negotiation, during the course of negotiations, people will ask you, what do you want? And you actually don't really know what you want. And so people are quite often taken off guard. And that's a bad thing, because that means the person who's sitting, and there's always this imbalance of power. And we'll address that just now in terms of creators feeling a little bit insecure. But generally, we're negotiating with someone who holds power, holds a certain interest that we want to have access to, or they have something that we need. And what are the tools that we need to use in these negotiation skills? So we've covered the first things that the very basic things that we need to have in terms of our approach. The second thing would be understanding your counterpart's constituency. And that is really an important thing. And to make this a little bit more concrete, recently I was part of a negotiation, or I was doing the negotiations for a big artist in terms of extending the brand into a homeware situation. And in terms of doing this, it was very interesting to note that clearly the other side had the ability to create a huge amount of opportunity in terms of retail and visibility, and also was a huge corporate that was able to invest a huge amount of money and capital behind it to extend or flesh out this collection that we were doing. And you've got to think carefully into saying, okay, why did we go to this person? What do they have? So you've got to understand what their positives and their strengths are, and how you play into these things. Because in this particular instance, I was looking at the fact that they had a huge amount of distribution capability, and distribution is quite a key element when you're wanting to do these kind of things in retail. It's always about distribution and the number of stockers. So this was a very interesting thing. So I had to also understand how the counterpart's business model worked. And this will give you, in any situation, if you understand your counterpart's method of work, their modus operandi, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, then you can actually be very strong in your negotiation. So this is a very, very important, and quite often it changes the scope of how you're negotiating or what you're negotiating for. Because you might think, okay, well, actually they've got a lot more to offer, so I'm going to throw this into the kind of melting pot in terms of negotiation. The other thing with when it comes to creatives, quite often in terms of a negotiation, you are in a position where you're brokering a deal, for lack of a better word, a deal, a situation, a context, and a collaboration, partnership, whatever it is, with someone. And whether you're brokering a deal with someone to represent you as an artist, you're brokering a deal in terms of selling some of your work, a collaboration, any of these kind of instances, you really have to look at what are the short-term benefits and the long-term benefits for you. And these are very, very important things, because as an emerging creative, the short-term benefits sometimes outweigh the long-term benefits in terms of the initial engagement. So in the beginning, for instance, you might want to go with an agent that's representing you, that's going to give you quite a lot of traction in the beginning, bring what you need, the visibility, the cash flow. But long term, they may not be able to fulfill your ambition of achieving a wider footprint or a global footprint. So it means that you might need to go into another form of negotiation. So you always got to weigh that up. The other thing is, who are you dealing with? So, you might have a very reputable, strong association with possibly in a collaboration or an agency or a gallery in terms of your work, but it might be for a very small or minimal reward. So you have to offset exposure association, which is a brand value, and it adds to your asset as a brand versus an immediate benefit or need, which is a financial need. So that's a very, very important thing. So again, to concretize this, I was dealing recently with an artist who is working with the house of Christian Dior, and the artist was asked to do a print for a children's wear range, and I was asked if I could actually help or assist with the brokerage or the negotiation of this deal. And my advice to the artist was, look, I don't think the fee is very good, but I think the exposure overall is immense. So why don't we put into the negotiation that you'd agree to do this on principle you understood what the marketing strategy and what the PR strategy is, because the association to the brand, which gave you instant global coverage, and the PR value could far outweigh if you did an audited kind of value of the PR outcomes, or exposure could outweigh the financial benefit. Now, to a large extent, I also feel sometimes we get too hooked onto the whole process of negotiation when it comes to money. In this particular instance, the financial reward was smaller, but the overall exposure outweighed that financial benefit. And the other thing is, I feel we shouldn't get hooked. It's quite often, especially African creators are asked in terms of collaborations. And I do understand that when they're dealing with big brands, and we'll come to this again later when I talk about positive and coercive strategies in terms of negotiation. But one of the very interesting things is we get hooked on the fact that, we're dealing with a foreign brand, a bigger brand, and they're paying us so little in terms of what we're doing. Now, this is just in their culture. That's what they do. I don't necessarily agree with it. I don't necessarily think it's the right thing to do. But I think as long as it's not completely exploitative, then it's an opportunity to embrace, to build one's own brand. And I think that if you use it wisely, if you leverage it yourself, and if you throw in other smaller things into the negotiating conversation, the negotiations, it can bring a huge amount of kind of benefit to a creative. So that's very, very important that we look at what the short-term benefits are versus the long-term benefits are. The very interesting thing about looking at negotiations are also to think of whether you're going to work with this person or brand or partner, whoever it is, as a counterpart again, because this actually also determines how you negotiate. If you have a long-term relationship, then you might have to forego certain things in the negotiations, because you have a far more longer. It's not a short-term kind of thing. It's not, it's not a fixed term thing. Your counterpart has a vested interest in you as a brand. So you just also got to think about this, and you also got to think, while you think about this, what is your exit strategy and how do you negotiate that exit strategy should that need arise? This is a very important thing. Then when we look at these negotiations, the most important thing, I think, or very crucial thing in terms of what we're doing, is looking at what is the nature of the leverage in terms of negotiation. So what are we offering in terms of the negotiations, right? So quite often as artists or creators, we feel very weak. We feel very empowered. We kind of constantly having to oversell ourselves, obviously always justifying what we're doing, how we're doing it, and the value. And this, unfortunately, is an issue that is not kind of just endemic to Africa. It's one that's a global thing. I mean, for forever and a day, people will constantly undervalue creatives in forms of negotiations. I mean, just one of those things, because we quite often thought about as not having the skills, the left brain skills, to quantify our value, our worth, and what that entire relationship is actually worth. As creators, what we tend to do is we tend to feel very insecure in dealing with bigger corporates or individuals who have kind of got a very established track record. And so we tend to kind of feel that we're already on a lower footing when we enter these negotiation skills. And quite often you'll encounter individual brands, corporates, whoever they are, and they're quite pushy. They will bring very hardcore kind of elements in terms of their negotiation and will want you to concede or offer them more in relation to what you originally were offering or bringing to the party. So in an agency, somebody might say, well, I don't want 20%, I want 30%, so it's that kind of discussion. Or in terms of royalty sales, and I want 10% on an ongoing basis, and they won't factor, things like inflation and escalation clause. They won't do those things. And as creators, we don't really necessarily think about these things. So their strategy, the counterpart's strategy with creators, is always to coerce you. It's to coerce you into accepting a deal, accepting a negotiated context or situation. It's not necessarily always fair. It's not necessarily always even ethical. But this is generally quite often the case in business. But you can change all of that and make it quite positive. And in terms of making it positive and what you bring, or you've got to constantly kind of conscientize the counterpart to, is the fact that there's a talent involved, and with that talent and creativity comes intellectual property, which you're bringing to the table. That intellectual property has a value. And I think one must never underestimate the fact that you have somebody sitting opposite you. So you do have their attention. And so no matter how blasé they might be, they have come to the party to listen and to talk. So this is a very important thing, I think, even just psychologically for you to understand. So talent and intellectual property and the value around this is very crucial to constantly bring it back into the realm of the discussion. What you offer as a brand or what you can offer as a brand is important. So there's a PR story around it. And that story can be about your work, it can about being your engagement with the community, it can be about you and your legacy that you've come from or you wanting to create. It's very important. And then this conversation around brand is very important because quite often we have a counterpart sitting in front of us that wants us and wants us because we are a brand. And part of what they're going to do is hopefully invest in creating this brand. So how are they doing that? And the process is very, very important because it's got to be in line with your vision, your ethic, and your way of doing business. Even if you're not very consciously aware of it, you got to be very, very conscious about who you're getting into bed with.